We have to start. I guess we are already 10 minutes late. It's very hot. Thanks for coming in this hot weather. I'm Murat Paker, Director of the Clinical Psychology Graduate Program here at the Bilgi University, İstanbul Bilgi University. We are very much honored to have three very distinguished guests today. This is a very special event. We have organized this event in collaboration with Doku Psychological Counseling Center and Istanbul Neuropsychoanalysis Study Group. This is our second collaborative event. And we are very fortunate that we have three very leading, founding, big names with us this evening. My colleague Gökçe, psychologist Gökçe, will be introducing more about the introductions and about the guests. I just wanted to say welcome on behalf of my program and my university. Enjoy.
So hi, welcome again in place of Istanbul Bilgi University Clinical Psychology Department, Doku Psychotherapy Center and Istanbul Neuropsychoanalysis Study Group. We are so proud of welcoming Professor Mark Solms, Professor York and Professor Brian Johnson today here in Istanbul, and we will be delighted to listen to their precious talks. I don't want to take too much from your time, and I want to leave more time for our speakers, but what I want to say briefly is this symposium, the Conscious ID, Neuropsychoanalysis of ID Symposium, has been announced on a very interdisciplinary ground via Turkish Psychologists Association, Turkish Psychiatry Association, Turkish Neuropsychiatry Association, and Neuropsychology Association, which has been the first in the history of Istanbul Neuropsychoanalysis studies. And we are proud of welcoming you all here. And I see our collaborators here, and I welcome them as well. And so Mark is waiting to talk. I don't want to steal too much time from his talk. I would like to introduce him just shortly. He is the father of neuropsychoanalysis in my mind. He is the director of the International Society for Neuropsychoanalysis, and he has been traveling around too much this month, and he was so kind to come to Istanbul, and he will speak about conscious ID today. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here once more. Over the last nearly 3 decades now, the main thing that I've been doing with my scientific life is trying to draw links between psychoanalysis and the neurological sciences, since that is now possible, to try to bring the concepts which Freud and his followers derived from clinical observation, because they had no other methods available to them, to try and bring to bear the methods of contemporary neuroscience on those concepts. Obviously, to be able to translate concepts derived from clinical observation into concepts that can be studied using the very powerful methodologies that we have available to us today in the neurological sciences renders those concepts so much more open to scientific scrutiny, and therefore the knowledge that they represent becomes all that more reliable. So as I said, over the last, I don't even know exactly how many years now, that's what I've been doing, and I've been doing it across various different topics. And in the process of doing that, the first step is one of translation. It's taking the psychoanalytical, the basic psychoanalytical concepts and finding what their neural correlates are. And it's really easier said than done, because these concepts don't naturally and easily and simply lend themselves to translation. It's easy to do it in a way that looks as if you found something that's neurologically equivalent, but to actually be sure that what you're dealing with is the neural equivalent of these very complex and subtle concepts is a difficult task in its own right. Why it's so important to get the translation phase right is that once you have made the translation, then you can render the psychoanalytical theories open to neuroscientific testability. That's the whole point of translating them. It's because psychoanalytical concepts via the psychoanalytical method are notoriously difficult to test. They don't give rise to predictions that one can test in a simple critical experiment. That's because the stuff of the mind, it's fleeting, fugitive stuff, doesn't lend itself easily to experimental control. And I think it's very much to the credit of Freud and the psychoanalysts that they at least tried to bring that stuff into science. The mind, after all, exists. As difficult as it may be for us to do experiments on it, nevertheless, there it is, you know. Things like feelings and fantasies and memories, subjective states, all, they exist, they're part of nature. And I think we do a great disservice to the science of the mind if we don't take account of these difficult and subtle, invisible things. But once we can translate them into visible material processes, it's so much easier to do science on them. Now, in the process of conducting this translation and finding those neural correlates, it's been very gratifying and very rewarding in some instances. For example, in the case of dream theory, which I've spoken about in Istanbul once before, it's been very gratifying to find those neural correlates in the first place, and then secondly to be able to do experiments on the dreaming brain, which have led to, in my view, really quite remarkable confirmation of the validity of some of the basic theoretical claims of Freud and the psychoanalytical school in relation to dreams. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be allowed to talk to you about that today, because it's very much easier than what I am going to be talking to you about. In the process of conducting these translations, sometimes one finds that you can't make the concepts of the one discipline fit with the concepts of the other. So it means you can't reach the second step of testing the theory, because you just can't make the theory fit, even with the basic descriptive facts. And this is something that's happened to me that I'm going to talk to you about in the case before us today. It's a very big problem, and partly for that reason it's difficult for me to talk about it, because I've come across a way in which psychoanalytical and Freudian theory in particular cannot be translated, cannot be made to fit, even at a descriptive level, with the currently available neuroscientific facts. And this means that there's a huge problem with the theory. So, as I say, it's emotionally difficult, because nobody wants to find a theory that they've been so attracted to for so long has a huge problem slap bang in the middle of it. But it's also difficult because I have all these years thought in Freudian ways. My whole education was Freudian, and my whole way of thinking about the mind was Freudian, because I found it an extremely valuable, rich, sophisticated, and useful theoretical approach to the mind. So it's difficult for me to now have to recognize that there's a fundamental way in which that theory is wrong. So that, you know what they say about teaching an old dog new tricks. It's very hard. So for that reason also, the things I want to talk to you about, I must apologize in advance may not be as clear as I would like them to be, because for me, myself, they're not clear. I keep on losing focus and getting confused. Really, in this time available to me, I'm going to tell you one thing. So that makes it easier. As I said, there's one big problem, and I'm going to tell you what that problem is. Once I've done that, I will start to talk about some of the implications. I don't know how many implications I'll get through. Let's just see. I am partly myself still busy trying to think these things through. So I'm partly using you as to help me, to give me an excuse to think aloud, and we'll see what you make of it. So the one idea that I'm going to tell you, I know I will be able to get that across clearly. The rest of it, you know, we're all in it together. Let's see what happens. Okay, here we go. There are two aspects to... We had a congress in Berlin last year. It was called Minding the Body. And it was about how the body is represented in the brain and the mind, about the embodiment of the mind, the embodied nature of the mind. And in listening to the various speakers, including Professor Panksepp, who's sitting down here, he presented a very rich paper. Antonio Damasio gave a paper, Bud Craig gave a paper, Vittorio Galeazzi gave a paper, and somebody named Manos Tsakiris, who you might not know. All of them doing excellent work on how the mind and brain are embodied, how the body is represented in the mind and brain. And as I was listening to them, something sort of jigged in a way that it had never properly jigged before. I saw there's actually a very simple thing which is not being seen clearly, which leads to some confusion. The simple thing is that there really are two different aspects of the body represented in the brain. Or to put it differently, the body is represented twice over in the brain, or the body is represented in two different ways in the brain. And that's what I want to tell you about first. These are fairly well-known facts. One bit of it, quite a new development, but for the most part, fairly well-known facts, which I'm just trying to report to you in as clear a way as possible so that we can have conceptual clarity about it. Excuse me, that's a burp. So there are two aspects of the body represented in the brain, and now I want to tell you about the one aspect and then about the other aspect. The first aspect is the somatosensory, somatomotor, musculoskeletal body, which is projected, literally mapped onto the surface of the brain in a somatotopic fashion. That means there's a more or less one-to-one correspondence between different parts of the surface of the body and different parts on the surface of the brain, where the body is literally projected onto the brain. The best known part of this is the somatosensory homunculus over here, you know, where, not to put too fine a point on it, basically the head is down here and the hands and the trunk, and then over here is the genitals, and then down on the other side is the legs. You know, it's a little person mapped onto the brain, upside down, facing backwards. But it's not only the somatosensory body that's mapped onto the brain in this way. All of the different sensory modalities are mapped, so that there's a map also for auditory and for visual and for gustatory and so on sensation. And I'm not even worrying about the vestibular cerebellar system so far. All of these mapping, like for example here, mapping the retina, mapping that portion of the surface of the body onto the surface of the brain. The body image doesn't exist in these maps, but rather in some sort of convergence between them. It arises from these maps. We have a sort of an image, literally an image, a projection of the external body, which converges via these different sensory modalities in what we call association cortex. And here I've combined unimodal association cortex with heteromodal association cortex, just to give you a nice simple picture. This is the map of the body, of the outside of the body onto the surface of the brain. We mustn't forget there's also the motor homunculus, another little upside down person mapped onto the surface. The the body image doesn't arise only from sensory information, but also from the sort of kinesthetic sensory aspect of movement. So there's a sort of three-dimensional image mapped onto the back of the brain of this aspect of the body. Now, to clarify in relation to what I'm going to talk about just now, this we might call the external body. That's the short phrase I'm going to use for it. And the external body gives rise to our classical sensory modalities. We know our external body via our classical sensory modalities. That's what these maps are. So we have a visual, auditory, somatosensory, somatomotor, gustatory, olfactory, external body. And in fact, the contents of our consciousness, of all the objects in the world, are represented in these modalities. And I want to just pause there for a second, because this is one little bit which is not so absolutely obvious and intuitive, although when I say it you won't disagree with it. Please note that we map the external portion of our bodies, we represent the external aspect of our bodies in the same way as we map or represent other people's bodies. So when I look at my body visually or in the mirror, and I look at your bodies, it's represented in the same way. It's the same modalities are used for representing other objects as for representing my own body as an object. Okay. Now we turn to the second aspect of the body in the brain. There are, deep within the brain stem, several nuclei, and here I'm just very roughly mapping out some of them. I mean, the hypothalamus is the best known among them, but there are these ventricular organs, and there's parabrachial nucleus, and there's nucleus of solitary tract, and the area postrema, and so on. These brainstem nuclei, which represent the autonomic body. They represent and control, just as I should have said that this somatosensory body and somatomotor body, it doesn't only receive information from the body, it also sends information to the body. You act on the outside world via your external body. Likewise, these structures represent the internal goings-on of the visceral body and also regulate those goings-on. These body mapping structures or body regulating structures are absolutely fundamental to the maintenance of life, not to put too fine a point on it, for obvious reasons. And they, in turn, are intricately interconnected with what might be seen as the equivalent of the association cortex in relation to the outside body, to these other structures which collectively we refer to as the extended reticular thalamic activating system, which are arousal structures which arouse the forebrain and generate the basic state of consciousness. You might think of it as the level of consciousness or the sort of quantitative dimension of consciousness, sleep and waking and whatnot. This is old knowledge. We've known about this since the 1940s. We know it in more detail today than we used to. That these structures are absolutely fundamental to switching on the lights, to the background state of consciousness. To put it in, I hope, a clear way, these structures they provide the page on which the contents of consciousness are inscribed. It's sort of the state of being conscious, which then allows you to have visual, auditory, somatosensory contents within this background state of conscious being. That's what this aspect of consciousness is all about. So these body mapping or body regulating structures which regulate the internal aspects of the body, which for the most part are not really, there's very dim and very indirect and very minimal representation of the internal body on this external cortical surface that I spoke about earlier. These structures are much more responsible for representing that internal, autonomic, vegetative, visceral aspect of the body. And they give rise to a different aspect of consciousness. The way in which we become aware of the internal body is not as an object, but rather as a state, as the state of being conscious. All of that, as I said, is old news. We've known this since the 40s and the 50s. We just know a little bit more detail about it. But in recent years, there have been some interesting developments in addition to what I've just said to you that we've learnt about this aspect of the brain. And in fact, I'm not being polite when I say to you that we owe this additional knowledge more to York Psikanaliz, who's going to speak after me, more to him than to any other scientist on this planet. He pioneered the view that I'm now going to describe to you, which has gradually acquired more and more adherence, and probably since Antonio Damasio attached his name to these views, they've become widespread and relatively popular. I'm referring to the fact that these structures don't just switch on the lights. It's not just a quantitative dimension to the consciousness that's generated by these structures. What has become apparent in recent years, as I say, largely, if not initially, almost exclusively as the result of the work of York Psikanaliz, is that this aspect of consciousness, this aspect of body representation, also has a qualitative dimension to it. It also feels like something to be conscious. Just as vision and audition and olfaction have qualia, have particular conscious qualities to them, particular feels to them, so does this aspect, this background state of being conscious, have a particular feel to it. And that feel is not visual, it's not auditory, it's not somatosensory, it is affective. This has been the great insight of recent years that is fundamentally changing our understanding of what this part of the brain does. It's probably best illustrated in relation to the periaqueductal gray, but by no means exclusively to the periaqueductal gray, that the stimulation of these brain structures gives rise, depending on where you stimulate, not only to volume of consciousness, quantitative level of consciousness, but to feelings of intense pleasure and unpleasure. You all know from your personal experience that you have pleasurable and unpleasurable feelings. Things feel good or things feel bad. What we sort of now can say in retrospect with a kind of, well, of course, yes, who would have ever denied it? This is a big part of the contents, not just the level, but the contents of our consciousness. And this dimension, these qualia, are not derived from our external sensory organs. You don't see joy. I mean, you can see somebody looking as if they might be feeling joy, but you feel your own joy. You feel your own pleasures and your own pains. They are states of the subject. They are states of the subject. They're states in a deep and profound sense of the visceral body. Not only that, but this is the foundation of it. And the general view that's been developed is that the reason why consciousness, this aspect of consciousness, developed at all is because it reflects the state of of how the body is doing within a biological system of values. By a biological system of values, I mean things which are good for your survival and reproductive success feel good, and things that are bad for your survival and reproductive success feel bad. That's what good and bad feelings are for. Pleasure means do this some more. It'll help you to survive and it'll help you to reproduce. Unpleasure means don't do that anymore. It's bad for your chances of surviving and reproducing. That's what the conscious feelings are there for. And the view is that, and this is a theoretical view, what I'm saying now, it may be wrong, but the view is that this is what consciousness evolved for in the first place. This is why we need to have conscious feelings at all. It's because it has this profoundly important capacity to tell the subject in the here and now how they're doing. It's a regulator of self-directed behavior. Because, as I said, these are not just feelings. These feelings are attached to compulsive motivations. If something feels good, you want to do more of it. If something feels bad, you want to withdraw from that. Approach, avoid. So there are compulsive, peremptory motivations and motor tendencies that arise from these feelings, which enhance, as I say, our chances of surviving and reproducing, which is why these things were selected in and conserved in the first place. Over and above that, of course, you all know life is more complicated than good and bad. So over and above that evolved a whole set of more complex instinctual emotional circuits. And again, we owe more than anyone to York Psikanaliz the elucidation of the anatomies and chemistries of these systems. I'm not going to run through them all, except to just give you the sort of general flavor of what I'm talking about. These are different varieties of goodness and badness in the feeling world. There isn't just good and bad. There are universal situations, biologically significant situations, which you can absolutely be certain are going to occur to every living creature of this level of complexity. Situations in which the feeling of fear, for example, is something that you dare not learn for yourself. You know, you can't wander over to a cliff and say, wonder what will happen if I jump off this, you know, and learn for yourself. There are certain things which are just built in. When you come to this sort of situation, freeze. Don't go any further. And the feeling tells you, don't go any further. That's called fear. Or another version of fear, get the hell out of here. You know, not saying, yeah, there's a lion coming to me with his jaws open. I wonder what it's going to do. You know, let me just check this out. Then I'll learn all about it. You know, so they're built-in ways of responding: fear, rage, separation, distress, or the wish to be together with caring, with caregivers, and whatnot. You know, lustful, instinctual impulses, of course, too. There are a variety of these. York Psikanaliz has outlined with great experimental detail at least 7 such systems. The things I want to emphasize is that they are unconditioned. That is, they are inbuilt. We are born with them. We know fear. We know rage. We just have it. And there's certain ways of behaving that come with it. We have to learn what to attach it to. There's certain inbuilt stimuli, but then we learn to attach these feelings to objects in the world, and that's a developmental process. But the actual basic programs that these things represent are, in a word, instinctual. They are our phylogenetic inheritance. So that's the second aspect of the body, of the representation of the internal body, the visceral body, the vegetative body, and these arousal structures and instinctual, emotional, behavioral circuits that are built upon them. All of them governed by affects, by feelings. This is what gives them their meaning, just as wavelengths of light give meaning to aspects of visual perception and so on. These are the 2 aspects of the body. Wow, simple. Now, to Freud. Freud also divided our mental apparatus into 2 aspects. And it's really quite remarkable how, once you've got clarity in your mind about the body is represented twice in the brain, it's represented in 2 different ways in the brain. The one is the external aspect of the body in relation to our classical sensory and motor modalities. And then the other represents the internal body, and it relates to the affective feel of the subject as opposed to the object world and these instinctual emotional programs that go with it. It's really quite remarkable how easy it is to map it onto Freud. Freud divided the mind very broadly into an ego and an id. The superego is a kind of a complication about the ego, which I don't know if we're going to have time to explain all of that, but for now just know these are the big bits. So the ego, Freud tells us, is derived from the external body, just as I've just described to you. Here he says it. The ego, this is in his famous book, The Ego and the Id. He says, the ego is first and foremost a bodily ego. It's not merely a surface entity, but is itself the projection of a surface. If we wish to find an anatomical analogy for it, we can best identify it with the cortical homunculus of the anatomists, which stands on its head in the cortex, sticks up its heels, faces backwards, and as we know, has its speech area on the left-hand side. And then here there's a little footnote, which I'll now read to you. The ego is ultimately derived from bodily sensations, chiefly from those springing from the surface of the body. It may thus be regarded as a mental projection of the surface of the body, besides, as we have seen above, representing the superficies of the mental apparatus. The superficies of the mental apparatus, he's meaning it's on the surface of the mental apparatus. It's this outer membrane of the mental apparatus. So there you have it, very clear. Now Freud's saying that the ego, one half of the mental apparatus, is derived from a projection of the external body onto the surface of the mind. Now we all know the ego isn't only the bodily ego. The ego is derived from the bodily ego, and that is all of our perceptions. All of our perceptions which become memory traces are derived from our classical external sensory modalities, which are distributed over the sensory receptor organs on the surface of the external body. So just as I said earlier on in relation to the cortex, that it's not just the actual map, but rather the information that derives from that map and gives rise to these association cortices, that we have the whole sort of cognitive apparatus that derives from external sensory perception. Likewise with the ego, we're not saying that the ego is only that little bubble on the top there. We're saying it's derived from it. The ego is derived from the surface of the body. Why do I say that? Well, Freud said it. There he said it, and there he said it. Okay, now what about the id? Where is the id derived from? The id, cut off from the external world, has a world of perception of its own. It detects with extraordinary acuteness certain changes in its interior, especially oscillations in the tension of its instinctual needs, and these changes become conscious as feelings in the pleasure-unpleasure series. It's hard to say, to be sure, by what means, and with the help of what sensory terminal organs these perceptions come about. But it's an established fact that self-perceptions, kinesthetic feelings and feelings of pleasure-unpleasure, govern the passage of events in the id with despotic force. The id obeys the inexorable pleasure principle. Now, I must just tell you this word here, instinctual needs. The German word there is Triebe, which is really not correctly translated as instinct. A Trieb is a drive. It's the way to translate Trieb is definitely drive, because in German there is a word Instinct, which is what is the equivalent of instinct. So this is an unfortunate mistake that the translator made. But fortunately, Freud describes to us quite clearly what he means by a Trieb. A Trieb, translated as instinct, appears to us as a concept on the frontier between the mental and the somatic, as the psychical representative of the stimuli originating from within the organism and reaching the mind, as a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work in consequence of its connection with the body. So I hope you can see quite clearly this aspect that I was talking about earlier in relation to the internal, the mapping of the internal visceral vegetative autonomic state of the body that gives rise to needs detected in the hypothalamus and these other core brainstem structures that I mentioned earlier. This is the sort of thing that Freud was talking about in that slide. But Freud did also talk about what we would translate correctly as instincts or basic emotions of the kind that belong with these white arrows in this slide over here. Here he talks about them very clearly. And what is an affect in the dynamic sense? It is in any case something highly composite. An affect includes in the first place particular motor innervations or discharges, and secondly, certain feelings. The latter are of two kinds: perceptions of the motor actions that have occurred and the direct feelings of pleasure and unpleasure, which, as we say, give the affect its keynote. But I do not think that with this enumeration we've arrived at the essence of an affect. We seem to see deeper in the case of some affects and to recognize that the core which holds the combination we've described together is the repetition of some particular significant experience. This experience could only be a very early impression of a very general nature, placed in the prehistory not of the individual but of the species. Now, Freud has a quaint way of talking about this, sort of Lamarckian thing that you actually remember, the prehistory of your species. It's not an experience, of course. We don't remember these primal scenes from prehistory. But what Freud's clearly talking about without a proper understanding of the mechanisms concerned is that we have built into us certain sort of primal scenarios which are built in of an affective kind. They're in relation to certain situations of universal significance, and they come from our phylogenetic heritage. These are, he calls them basic affects. They're exactly the same thing as what I was talking about earlier, as these fear situations and rage situations and attachment situations and so on. If you follow this line of conceptualization in Freud, you will find that it certainly exists there. He sometimes calls them primal fantasies. He went into it more in relation to anxiety than other affects, but it's very clear that he too had a concept of there being built-in instinctual programs related to certain scenarios which they're triggered by, which you don't have to learn. They're just built into the mind. All of that stuff goes under the heading of id. This is phylogenetically determined. It's given by your biological inheritance. It's not something that you have to learn for yourself. So you see, we have a very clear mapping of these two aspects of the mind in relation to the brain, as I've summarized it for you. There are elements of theory in what I said to you about how consciousness arose because of these body-regulating survival, reproductive success adaptations that they provide. These theories might be wrong, they might be right. That's not important. The important thing is it's absolutely unequivocally, factually, empirically demonstrable that that aspect of the brain regulates the internal body and gives rise to the core background state of consciousness, and that includes peremptory affects, emotions, and instinctual programs that go with it, and that this aspect gives rise to the representation of the external world via external sensory organs, and that the same applies to Freud's ego and his id. About all of that, I think there really can be no argument, unfortunately, because it gives rise to a huge problem. And I don't know if the problem is apparent to you. I mean, maybe it's apparent to you from the title of my talk. If this is where consciousness, the core background state of consciousness comes from, and if these structures perform the same function as this guy over here, then how come for Freud the id was unconscious? For Freud, all consciousness derives from the perceptual consciousness system. And this system is deeply unconscious, unbewusst. Here it seems to be exactly the other way around. In fact, these structures here give rise to consciousness, and these structures here, and this is again something that only in recent years, in very recent years, we've come to realize, are unconscious in themselves. Let me make that point clear. If you lesion, I mentioned earlier the periaqueductal gray. If you lesion periaqueductal gray, you don't only lose the capacity to feel pleasure and unpleasure. You lose the capacity to feel anything. You go deeply into a coma. You're unconscious altogether. That's because these more recent evolutionary acquisitions, these external perceptual modalities of consciousness, are hierarchically dependent upon these for their activation. You can remove visual cortex and lose the capacity to have visual consciousness. And you can remove somatosensory cortex and become anesthetic in your body, and you can become, anosmic and blah, blah, some kind of freak show. You can remove all of these external perceptual modalities. There'll be something left, which is you, feeling like I'm here, I'm being in the world, like in a sensory deprivation tank. There's still you, the affective presence of yourself. Yourself is not these external these are about the object world, the external world. This is about the subjective state of being in the world. But not the other way around. You see, if you lesion these, this thing here still keeps you alive and awake and conscious. But you remove these guys, all of these switch off. So they depend on them for their consciousness. Here we have it the other way around, according to Freud. The whole point of the talking cure, the whole point of talking to your patients, is to bring consciousness in words down to these unconscious levels to render these deeply unconscious, non-representational things conscious. This is the whole point of psychoanalysis. You see what I mean when I say it's a big problem, and why it caused me, and is still causing me, great befuddlements and confusions. But I really don't think that we can see it any other way. I've given you the basic facts of the anatomy and the functions that go with those two broad categories of anatomical structure that map the body. I've shown you the Freudian texts themselves to show you how Freud said exactly the same, these two aspects of how the body is mapped in the brain. And I've showed you that one thing that Freud couldn't have known is that the id, the structures that map the triebe, that give rise to the triebe and the instincts built over them, that these are intrinsically, fundamentally conscious structures. That this is not only where consciousness arises, where affective consciousness arises, it's where all consciousness ultimately derives from. Because without those structures, there can be no consciousness up here. For Freud, like for so many of his colleagues throughout the whole of classical German neurology, and not only German neurology, which cast such a long shadow over all the behavioral neurology that followed, right up to this present day, there are a great many people who still have this basic corticocentric assumption that consciousness is somehow bound up with the cortex. But the facts of the matter are very different. I want to show you that I'm not putting words, I'm not attaching an interpretation to Freud. Freud said this. He says that word presentations, remember these are the things that we use in our therapy, that one time they were perceptions. This is why words are good, is because they come from the outside. Because they're perceptions, they leave memory traces, which means they can become conscious again. It dawns on us like a new discovery that only something which has once been a conscious perception can become conscious. That anything arising from within, apart from feelings, coming back to that, seeks to become conscious, must try to transform itself into external perception. This is why we put words to things. But what about the feelings? He's not saying anything about the feelings. I'll come back to that in a minute. First, I want to show you this. He says, this system, that where the perceptions come from and the memory traces behind them, it must lie on the borderline between the outside and inside. It must be turned toward the external world. It must envelop the other psychical systems. It'll be seen that there's nothing daringly new in these assumptions. We've merely adopted the views on localization held by cerebral anatomy, which locates the seat of consciousness in the cerebral cortex, the outermost enveloping layer of the central organ. It's not Mark Solms who wrote that, Freud. And then he says, anatomy doesn't explain. Why should consciousness be on the outside? Odd thing, why isn't it safe inside in the core of the brain where it belongs? But, it isn't, says Freud. Now, what about the feelings? Remember, he said apart from feelings. Feelings, Freud recognized, to his credit, that they don't derive from external perception. He says these are something else. They don't come from the external body, from the external sensory organs. He says, blah, blah, since however these sensations, these are the ones, the feeling ones. It's true that we also receive conscious information from the inside of the body, the feelings, which actually exercise a more peremptory influence on our mental life than the external perceptions. Moreover, in certain circumstances, the sense organs themselves transmit feelings, sensations of pain, in addition to the perceptions specific to them. Well, we now know that pain has these two aspects, and the one aspect is the affective aspect. Since, however, these sensations, as we call them in contrast to conscious perceptions, also emanate from the terminal organs, and since we regard all these as prolongations or offshoots of the cortical layer, we are still able to maintain the assertion made above, the one at the beginning of the paragraph, namely this thing about everything being cortical. So there you have it again in Freud's own words. He's saying even the feelings which represent the internal state of the body are represented on the cortical surface. And he explained it in his interpretation of dreams. Here was external perception, here was the system consciousness, and the external perceptions related to the external world and then gave rise to memory traces, and then the conscious sensations, the feelings, gave rise to, represented the level of stimulation that had built up within this system. and then the discharge of the quantitative aspect gave rise to pleasure, and the pent-up registration of the quantitative aspect gave rise to unpleasure. This was the CS system, and this is the PCPT, the perceptual system, the consciousness system. Eventually, he combined them. In 1917, he said, just because, as I said to you before, with regard to the cortex, motor discharge gives rise to new sensation. Freud said, actually, it's one system. The perceptual consciousness system is one system. On its external surfaces, it registers the state of the outside world. On its internal surface, it registers the state of the interior of the apparatus. And this is his final model of how consciousness works. So consciousness for Freud always remains a cortical process, always relates to the surface of the mental apparatus, whether it's registering external stimuli or internal stimuli. That's how Freud conceptualized it. Now, I don't know if there's anyone here who's a Freud scholar who wants to argue with me about that, but I'll tell you I know Freud backwards. And this is what Freud said. Absolutely no question about it. So, as I say, we've got a big problem. Freud was a corticocentric theorist, and the corticocentric theorists we now know are wrong. Consciousness is not derived from the external world. It's not derived from the representation of the state of the external body. These stimuli are in themselves unconscious. The way that they're registered is in themselves unconscious. They only are rendered conscious by the extension of this deep brain structures consciousness onto them. And I've explained to you the basic facts for that. I could go through it 100 different ways. The most obvious way probably is to look at this thing called the cognitive unconscious, where all of these artful things that we're able to do perceptually and cognitively without consciousness arises from the fact that this system up here is not conscious. It doesn't need to be conscious to do all of its cognitive gymnastics. It's only when consciousness is extended to it from this deep centrancephalic structure, as they called it some time ago, that the consciousness is lent to the extraceptive surface. Now, I'm going to, out of all of the multitude of evidence for this view that I could cite for you, I'm just going to draw your attention to this one condition called hydranencephaly. These are children who are born without cortex. They have little slivers of cortex. Here you can see little bits of cortex, but this is completely non-functional for two reasons. First of all, because there's no white matter connecting this cortex to the thalamus, and secondly, because the cortex is totally gliosed anyway. These children have massive strokes in utero, massive cerebrovascular accidents, the entire anterior circulation, and the cortex is simply reabsorbed and replaced by cerebrospinal fluid. I'm using this one very dramatic example to illustrate to you the general point that I'm making, which is that cortex is not the origin of consciousness. Here's a girl with hydranencephaly. She has no cortex whatsoever. And here's one out of many different scenes that I could have shown you of her baby brother being put into her arms, and look at her response. This is a conscious child. This is an emotional child. And in fact, we know from animal experiments that emotionality is entirely preserved with the surgical removal of cortex. In fact, it's increased with the surgical removal of cortex. And in these children too. They're not very intelligent, they're not cognitive creatures, but they are conscious, they are there, they're emotionally present, and they have a full range of feelings. They show joy, they show fussiness and rage, they arch their backs. They show laughter, they show sadness, the basic feelings, the basic conscious feelings, instinctual affects, basic emotions, call them what you will, are there. These children also, amongst the many troubles that they're burdened with, are prone to seizures. They have absence seizures. And their parents have no difficulty recognizing when the child is having a seizure. She's gone. Whoop, she's back again. And that's weighty evidence for there being consciousness in these children. They lose consciousness and they regain consciousness. And as I said, the consciousness, when it's there, you can see it's within the bounds of the philosophical problem of other minds. There's absolutely no reason to believe anything other than that these children are fully conscious without any cortex. So this is, as I said, just one line of evidence to illustrate for you the sorts of empirical data that underscore and underpin the conclusion that we've come to in recent years, that cortex is not the seat of consciousness, that consciousness, that cortex is not intrinsically conscious, that cortex borrows its consciousness from deep brain structures, upper brainstem structures, which are the font of all consciousness, and that includes of external perceptual consciousness. It's derivative from this core brain consciousness, and this core brain consciousness is also affective consciousness. About this, I think there really can be no doubt. I know that there's lots of argument about it, and I know that this is still a novel idea, but I also know that the evidence is absolutely overwhelming, and it may well be that York will be talking about that later. So I will leave it at that for now. Okay, so what's the cortex for then? I've told you the main thing I wanted to tell you. I've got 15 minutes left. Is that right? So now I'll just tell you a few other things. You know, these are the things that I'm busy thinking about. What I've said to you so far is, I hope, clear to you and absolutely clear to me. You know, as much as I don't want to recognize it, I'm telling you, I can't escape it. The id is the font of all consciousness. The ego is unconscious in itself. It's exactly the opposite way to how we thought about it before. Now, without it, you know, it hardly needs saying that this has massive consequences for the whole of psychoanalysis. I've already told you the talking cure was based on the assumption that what we have to do is bring consciousness in the form of words, borrow consciousness from the cortex. Words have this wonderful thing of being derived from the outside, being perceptions. Therefore, they can be rendered conscious again. They can be turned back into perceptions. They can bring consciousness to things, and we drag them down, you know, to the id in order for us to get consciousness attached to these deeper workings of our minds. Now we know it's the exact opposite, that there's this consciousness bubbling up from the inner workings of our minds, and that the main function of the ego is somehow to constrain and contain this stuff. You know, it really has enormous implications, and I'm not going to begin to be able to go through all those implications in what is now 13 and a half minutes left to me, but I want to just say a few things about it. First thing is to ask ourselves this question, well then, what is the cortex for? If we can answer that question, what does the cortex add, then we'll begin to have some insights into how we might reconceptualize what the ego's functional role is within our psychoanalytical metapsychology. Well, I said to you at the beginning that the main thing, I said that we represent the outside world through these external perceptual modalities, the external objects in the world. And we also represent our own bodies as an external object. Through those same modalities. So here we start to have some sort of indication of what cortex is for. It generates objects, you know, and objects are jolly good things. They're stable things that you can think with. And where does this derive from? Well, it's not intrinsically conscious. This is information processing and information storage. So this relates to the massive memory capacity of cortex. Probably this is the single most important thing to say about what cortex adds. It has incredible capacity for representational forms of memory, deriving exactly from this mapping function that I mentioned in the first place. It makes representational maps of the world with the size of this memory space, renders these maps precise and detailed and also stable. The stabilizing properties of these maps enables us to think about, to hold in mind things going on around us. And rendering them conscious enables us to consciously feel things about them. So feeling, as I said to you in the first instance, has to do with interoceptive states and inbuilt instinctual programs. Now I can say that the extension of these feelings of consciousness, that is, onto these maps of the world, onto these stabilized representational images, enables us to feel this in relation to that. And this is not a bad thing, to be able to hold in mind and hold in mind in a stable form and in relation to each other, maps of yourself as an object in relation to other objects, and feel your way through the situation is a jolly important thing. So the first function, it appears, of cortex, and the main function, it appears, of cortex, is the generation of representational objects. Freud called them object presentations. Funnily enough, Freud said that the system unconscious was populated with object presentations. So, some things start to fall into place in a way that they didn't before. And this has also been my experience as I've gone through thinking through the consequences of this one shift, big as it is, as I've been thinking through the consequences of it for myself. So a whole lot of contradictions and odd things in Freudian metapsychology suddenly start to make a better sense. But object presentations is not all that we have in cortex, and nor is it all that we have in the Freudian theory, which I'm paralleling along here as we go. Object presentations are a problematical thing for exactly the reason that I told you. I said to you that we represent other objects in the same way as we represent our own bodies as objects. It's the same stuff, visual, somatosensory, tactile, so on. We represent them in the same way. So there's a kind of a sameness about self and other at that level of object presentation, which requires something more to happen. That's where I'm heading. But before I go to this, where there's something more that has to happen, I want to just dwell a little bit on this level of it, because I find it fascinating. And I think it'll help you to understand better what I'm talking about if I dwell on it a little bit more. What I'm saying is this, that the representation of yourself as an object is secondary. It's not yourself. The bodily ego is a memory. The bodily ego is a representation which you invest with self, with being, with presence. Remember, the self, the primary self, sentient subject, is id. It has to cathect this image, this memory image, this cortical representation, before you can think of your bodily ego. You then have a representation of yourself in mind. That's the first thing, and it's quite difficult to hold on to that, to recognize, because it's your own beloved self that you see in the mirror. Now you've got to realize that's like a figment. This is a memory image. The real me, that's looking at this thing is visceral, affective. That's the subject. The body as subject. The body as object is secondary. Now, to illustrate this point, there's some experiments being done. They're called body swap illusion experiments. Here's the most dramatic version of it. The experimental subject is given sort of goggles over their face, over their eyes. These goggles are a screen, which are connected to a camera, which are on goggles on somebody else's head. So that means you start to see the world from the other person's point of view. Okay? Then that person walks over to you and shakes hands with you. You feel yourself to be that person shaking hands with Mark Solms. That's what the experimental subjects report. They see this other body there, they recognize that's Mark Solms, and they go over to him and they shake his hand. But they don't feel they're Mark Solms, they feel they're this other guy. Which gives you a sense of how unstable is this thing, how ephemeral is this thing called the bodily ego, the representation of me as a thing. Worse than that, you can do the same thing with a robot. You can put the lenses onto a mannequin, a non-human thing out there, and still the experimental subjects report rapidly they feel themselves to be the robot, even though they know it's not even living. When they're looking at the world from that perspective, they feel themselves to be there, and this other thing that they're seeing to be the other, an object. Now, they feel it, they say it. We're back into the stuff of subjective report, and who knows, Well, you can do it yourself. Or you can do this, which is the wonderful illustration of the objectivity of the thing. The experimenter took a knife, put galvanic skin response and heart rate monitors onto the experimental subject, and went with a knife at Mark Solms, and went with a knife at the mannequin, and saw which one gave the fear response. Guess which one? By far the bigger fear response is on the mannequin, You know, so even though you know that's me, and that guy's going at me with a knife, the fear response is mild. But if that knife comes toward you, the mannequin, and then you feel shit, you know, fear. So there's an objective evidence that the experimental subject feels themselves to be inside the other body. You know, you see a little kid playing television games, like this, you know, very quickly they're in the screen, you know, and they are that little thing. You just cathect that object. So I'm saying all of this to illustrate this point that, you know, how quickly and how easily we project ourselves into an object, which is really a representation. It's not the self. The self is not the bodily ego. The self is not a representational thing. The self is a feeling state. It's a sentient presence of emotion, which then cathects these object representations, and it's here today, gone tomorrow. Think about schizophrenics. Think about ideas of reference. Think about out-of-body experiences. Think about autoscopic phenomena. It all falls boom, boom, boom into place. Really, the subject doesn't have to be in his body. You know, doesn't have to feel himself to be in his body. And they frequently don't. Now, I said we represent the other in the same way as we represent ourselves, using the same perceptual apparatus. Here, an obvious thing to bring into the story is mirror neurons. You know about mirror neurons? You know, the pattern of neuronal firing is identical if it's me doing the movement and if it's you doing the movement. So how do I know who's doing the movement? You know, if exactly the same neuronal pattern on the cortical surface represents she's moving, I'm moving, then, you know, how do you differentiate self from other? And I think that this is a very big part of what we've theorized in psychoanalysis actually for some time, this whole process of how do you differentiate me from not me. And this is one of the rich veins that we're going to be able to go into in the months and years to come. But Vittorio Galeazzi reported, he's one of the mirror neurons guys, as you know. He reported at our Congress in Berlin that they did a study with schizophrenic subjects in which they found the difference between schizophrenic subjects and non-schizophrenic subjects is that when the mirror neurons fire in us non-schizophrenics, there is in addition a fronto-insular set of neurons that fire as well. So this is adding something to this, the feeling of a body is moving, you know. Then there's something else which evidently has to do with this helps you to know that it's not your body that's moving over there. And that's a line of research that he's now busy pursuing. The point is just to illustrate this problematical nature of the way in which we invest ourselves into our bodies. Now, the place within psychoanalytical theory that this something else that's added has to do with what Freud called word presentations. This is not by any means meant to be wrapping up the whole thing. I mean, I know I now only have a couple of minutes left, and there are many other things I could tell you about, but I think that this is something, one line of thought, that will help us to understand what cortex adds. Not only the concrete object presentation, but also the word presentation, that is to say, the re-representation of the self abstractly. The ability to look back, to say not just object, you know, that's second person. It's subject and object, object, object. Subject, object, object. What's needed is whoop, outside, you know, which object? And the ability to abstract yourself and take the third person point of view is one of the enormous powers of words and of language. The ability to take this abstract sort of conceptual rather than perceptual, direct second person approach. So I could go into all of that, but I've only got seconds left. So let me just think. I'll leave that for now, and say also that that gives rise to the beginnings of the superego issue as well. That the superego is all about being able to see yourself from the point of view of not being the subject, but rather, you know, which is why words are such an important part of superego functioning. I think that I'll end on this note. Why do we have to make these presentations conscious at all? Because we've learned from cognitive science how much problem solving, perceiving, thinking, remembering, deciding, etc. we can do without consciousness. In fact, why do we need the consciousness? In fact, most of my cognitive science colleagues I'm sure they'd be only too happy to do away with the consciousness altogether. So why has nature put it there? It causes such trouble. And on this model that I've sketched for you, if we go back to what I said right at the very beginning, what consciousness is for, what the feelings are for, because ultimately, basically, that's what consciousness is. What the feelings are for is to tell you how you're doing. Is this good or is this bad? It's built within a basic valuative system. It guides your action. So if you have a purely zombie-like cognitive apparatus which just automatically does things, that's fine, as long as it's able to 100% perfectly predict what's out there. It'll deal with everything. But, sadly, as you've all learned from your own personal experience, we don't have a perfect model of what's out there, and we're constantly banging into what's out there, and it doesn't fit our expectations. This is what Freud called the reality principle, building into our minds a model of how the world is so that we can better predict how it is and better adjust to it. Because we don't have a perfect model of reality, in fact, through development and maturation, a very big part of what development and maturation is getting a better, more realistic picture of how the world really works, building up a better predictive model of the outside world. Every time that you bang into something that doesn't fit with what your expectation was, that's when you need a feeling. That's when it becomes salient. You pay attention to it. All these words fit here into our theoretical story. So feelings are needed when predictions don't work. There's Carl Friston, who's this really quite brilliant theorist in England, Carl Friston, working on this computational neuroscience stuff and the Bayesian brain and this predictive coding and error coding and so on, who's well worth reading on this score. He calls it surprise. So whenever a prediction doesn't work, then you get a surprise, which is, an affect. There's salience, now this thing matters, and you have to feel your way through the thing in order to find a way of dealing with something which you didn't have a model for before. This is probably what reconsolidation is for. The memory trace has to be activated, becomes conscious, then you work out a new connectivity for it, and then, okay, now we can reconsolidate that, now we know how it works. Now consciousness is not needed anymore. Please note, the consciousness is a bad thing from the biological point of view. The aim of development is to get to a pure nirvana-like existence where you have perfect predictions of everything, and you don't need any of these troublesome feelings. This, I suggest to you, gives us some hint into how we have to reconceptualize repression. I think what repression is a premature automatization of an object relationship, self-other relationship. I'm going to do it like this. This works. Yes, it does. Withdraw declarative awareness from this. Don't need it anymore. I'm doing it that way. Okay, that's now something repressed. It's because you so badly want to get to this point where there's no troublesome feelings. The problem, as you know, with doing things that way is what Freud called the return of the repressed. Which within the language that I've been using today, we would have to say that you're going to have constant surprises. There's going to be many an error, many a prediction error, if you operate on the basis of repressed fantasies, as we call them in psychoanalysis. They actually aren't the way that the world works. So there's a constant threat of the affect coming back, and you can see what rich veins of inquiry are open up to us for the future, which is our compensation for having to recognize that great genius that he was, in one very fundamental respect, Sigmund Freud was wrong. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Mark for this marvelous talk. I'm thinking that he's definitely the conscious id of our society. Now we have 10 minutes for questions, and then we have a short coffee break, just 10 minutes again. And we have to be careful with timing at coffee break, not to prolong the schedule. Thank you.
Yes.
Those people without cortex, how do they react
To a mirror. Well, they're blind. It's a very complicated topic, this, because when one says they're blind, which they are, you have to remember there's also blind sight. which goes back to the theoretical question that we were talking about earlier. So the perception by itself does not require consciousness, as we know. But it's actually a fairly crude form of perception. It's a sort of an associative form of perception where you don't have these stable object representations, which is what cortical perception allows. So there's a kind of a crude sensory perceptual reactivity, but it's not conscious working memory, holding a thing in mind kind of perception.
Do we have any evidence that they are
Self-aware.
self-aware?
No. I think that what we have is evidence only that they have feelings, but we also do know that they have simple associative learning. Like, for example, they learn to like certain people and to dislike certain people. They learn to like to play with certain toys and avoid certain situations which they dislike. So there is the beginnings of a kind of primitive associative learning, of emotional learning and procedural learning. But such complex reflexive types of thinking within the framework that I've outlined, I think that requires not only cortical object presentation, but even more than that, word re-representation for these kinds of thoughts. The problem is that you and I, us normal individuals with cortex, our consciousness is so filled with these mental solids that it blinds us, it obscures everything else from view. And it makes us think that this is what consciousness is all about, and you can see why the early German behavioral neurologists and others, and the English empiricist philosophers before them, why they came to that conclusion, that consciousness is this type of consciousness. But it's really not like that. And I know I'm no longer answering your question, so I better stop. Yes, gotcha.
Just a brief question. If it is the conscious one, are we the most conscious during our dreams?
Well,
Is this the highest consciousness level?
you see, I think that it's again a question of what your scale of values are. What counts as highest from the cognitive point of view, and let's not demean it. I mean, there is the reason that the cortex developed is not for nothing, and the reason that language then evolved above object representation is also not for nothing. I mean, this makes possible the conscious cognizing of relations between things, rather than just things themselves. And there's certainly a good argument for saying, well, that's the highest form of consciousness. I mean, self-aware, reflexive consciousness, what could be higher than that? The type of consciousness we have in dreams is pretty close to what Freud called primary process, which is an hallucinatory form of wish fulfillment. It's more affectively charged, in that sense. If affect is where you think the heights of consciousness are, and there's good reason for putting it that way, because certainly that's where the volume of consciousness and the kind of evolutionary and ontological precedent of consciousness lies. This is the elemental form of consciousness. You could say that's the highest form. But I want to just make a little side point, if I may, since you give me the excuse. Freud spoke of hallucinatory wish fulfillment as being the primary process type of thinking. Please notice that hallucinatory wish fulfillment requires, first of all, object presentation, and secondly, learning. You have to already know what it is that you're wishing for before you get to primary process hallucinatory wish fulfillments. So it's actually quite a few stages along. This is what we're having to build into the psychoanalytical model that wasn't there before. That there's a pre-representational form of consciousness. And if hallucinatory wish fulfillment was the primal form of consciousness, then you'd have to say that the mind begins with a system conscious and pre-conscious, which has learned something, and then derived from that is the repression of these fantasies. So the system conscious is derived from the system pre-conscious consciousness. Do you see what I mean? The repressed is derived from these fantasies, which first, hallucinations are not hallucinations unless they're conscious. So you can see why we need a different model. We need a model in which this representational stuff happens later, that there's something that comes before that, and that is primary raw affect. Well, lucid dreams are, again, it depends on your scale of values, which is higher or lower. Lucid dreams are, in a sense, less dreamlike than ordinary dreams, because there's some preserved reflexivity. There's some preserved awareness of the self, the actual objective state of the self. That's this third-person point of view in lucid dreaming. It correlates in functional neuroimaging with relative activation of dorsolateral frontal convexity. So it's less dreamlike. So if you think that cognitive forms of consciousness are the high ones, then lucid dreaming is better than ordinary dreaming. If you think that true, pure affective fields are the heights of consciousness, then lucid dreaming is a degraded form of dreaming. Depends on how you see it. I'll tell you something, lucid dreaming is not as clear-cut as people like Lebage try to make us believe. You know, it's quite hard to hold on to a lucid dream for the most part. Otherwise, it's not really a dream anyway, if it was easier. Yep.
Mark, it's very interesting for that. Where would you put in your model the intuition?
Well, intuition probably is best conceptualized, just to put it very simply, as the affective feel, the gut feel, you know, without having to necessarily think it through representationally. So you haven't worked out all that, you know, you haven't joined the dots representationally, but you have the affective feel, the intuition, you know, I feel my way through this, I feel my way through that, and that's actually how all problem solving works, except that we have to raise the affectivity, to use the value scale again, to the level of representational language, so that I can say, I did this because this is my theory, you know, and in a very compelling sense, you could say that's what psychoanalysis does as a treatment. It enables you to have, in words, when I said that Friston talks of mental development as reducing prediction error, you know, it's a matter of building a better predictive model of how the world works. The more that you're able to explicitly, consciously, that is to say, reflexively in words, say this is my model and it fits with everything. You know, it gives you there's less disparity between the actual facts of your life and your theory of how you are in the world. Probably that would be something like what we're working towards. So intuitions, nice as they are, you know, I think that there's good reason to try to raise them to a higher level of representability. I hope that I'm being clear, Professor.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Solms, for this very confusing speech. I wonder how you put your understanding of traumatic experience and repetition compulsion and beyond the pleasure principle in this aspect, in this conscious id aspect.
Well, I would be lying to you if I told you that I'd thought through everything, and I have not thought through what you're saying. I have only something, and I'm not even sure if it relates to the thing I've talked, because recently, since I thought of this, I must tell you honestly, my mind has been quite chaotic. You know, it's going off in all sorts of directions, and most of them initially feel very unpleasant, because it's discordant, and I can't make sense of it, and then eventually I get to a new solution, and I think, that's better, you know, and then so I keep on more and more feeling reassured that it really is necessary to make this adjustment, because in the end, the whole thing works better. Now, one of those little tangents that my mind has gone along recently has been thinking, well, hang on a minute, you know, this death drive, life drive thing, which is what you're referring to, and it's beyond the pleasure principle. There are enormous problems with the pleasure principle, because Freud said reduction in drive tension is pleasure. An increase in drive tension is unpleasure. That was in his first instinct theory. In his second instinct theory, he says that the increasing of tension is what the life drive does, and the reduction of tension is what the death drive does. So that would say that the reduction of tension, pleasure,